Hello, romance lovers. If you're a fan of Werewolf shifter romance audiobooks, you're in for a treat. This audiobook is packed with everything you crave: thrilling action, sizzling chemistry, and an irresistible alpha male at the center of it all. Whether you're here for the intense romance, the danger escape twists, or the supernatural allure of a gripping paranormal romance, this audiobook will have you hooked from the very first moment. It's the perfect escape into a world. So, grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let this steamy werewolf romance audiobook sweep you away. I promise it'll be an experience you won't forget. Press play, get comfortable, and let this werewolf shifter romance audiobook sweep you off your feet. Happy listening. Chapter 1: A Divided World. The city hummed with life, its energy palpable even as the crisp chill of autumn bit at exposed skin. College students bustled down the streets, their laughter and chatter mingling with the honking of horns and the hum of electric buses. The air carried the faint scent of roasted coffee beans, damp concrete, and freshly fallen leaves. Aria Thorne kept her head down, her hoodie pulled low over her face as she weaved through the throng of pedestrians. Her sneakers padded silently against the pavement, her movements instinctively fluid, almost feline. She didn't like to draw attention, not here, where even a flicker of suspicion could lead to trouble. Ahead, a government checkpoint loomed, an imposing presence that seemed to compress the space around it. The uniformed officers flanked the street, standing beside sleek black vehicles emblazoned with the insignia of the Unified Council. Their cold, detached expressions didn't waver as they stopped passers-by, scanning IDs and issuing clipped commands. Aria's stomach tightened as she approached, though her pace never faltered. She slid her ID card from her pocket, keeping her movements calm, practiced. Her heart gave a single, hard thud as she caught sight of a young werewolf mother being questioned a few feet away. The woman held a toddler close to her chest, her hands trembling as she handed over her ID. The officer's sharp, unyielding stares seemed to bore into her, searching for cracks in her composure. The child whimpered, clutching at the collar of his mother's coat, and the woman hushed him softly, her voice quivering. "Stay calm," the officer barked, his tone clipped and vaguely threatening. Aria's wolf stirred beneath her skin, a ripple of irritation that spread like an itch she couldn't scratch. Her wolf didn't like the scene any more than she did, but she couldn't afford attention. Not here, not now. The mother muttered an apology, shielding her child as though she could block him from the officer's disdain. That simple gesture struck a nerve in Aria. The corners of her mouth tightened. She forced herself to look away, though the woman's face stayed etched in her mind. It was the same story, repeated 1,000 times. Suspicion, fear, scrutiny. Werewolves didn't have the luxury of blending in, not like she did. Aria passed through the checkpoint with barely a glance from the guards, her ID cleared in seconds. As she slipped her card back into her pocket, a bitter thought bubbled to the surface. They don't even look twice at me because I'm controlled. If they knew the truth, they'd be terrified. The truth was simple, though she never spoke it aloud. She didn't need the suppressants most wolves relied on to dull their instincts and curb their primal urges. Her self-retrieval was perfect, unyielding and unnatural, and it set her apart, even from her own kind. Her gaze flicked to the officers in her peripheral vision, her mind darkening as she critiqued the world she lived in. Humans thought werewolves were ruled by their instincts, incapable of rationality or reason. Packs didn't help that perception, reinforcing stereotypes with their strict hierarchies and archaic rituals. Aria hated both worlds, the humans who feared her, the wolves. If anyone knew what she truly was, how her wolf remained silent, obedient, caged by sheer will, they wouldn't call her special. They'd call her dangerous. She stuffed her hands into her hoodie pockets, her pace quickening as she moved away from the checkpoint and into the busier streets of the city. Around her, laughter and conversation rose and fell, the noise washing over her in a dull roar. What would they do if they knew, she wondered, her throat tightening at the thought. That I'm not like the others? That I don't need their rules or their pills? She didn't have the answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. For now, it was enough to stay invisible, to keep moving forward. She tucked the thought away, burying it deep where no one, not even her wolf, could touch it. The city swallowed her whole, and she let it. The campus square was alive with voices, some heated, some indifferent, all humming beneath the sharp autumn air. Students spilled across the plaza, clustered in small groups or drifting toward the makeshift stage that had been set up near the fountain. Aria Thorne slipped through the crowd like a shadow, her hood still up, her hand. The scene wasn't unusual. Debates like this had become commonplace since the latest string of rogue werewolf attacks. Someone always had something to say, usually loud, often misguided. Today it was no different. Her eyes scanned the crowd, catching sight of the usual players. A group of human protesters waving neon signs that read "Safety First, Control the Wolves," and "Protect the Packless" stood to one side. Opposite them, a smaller group of werewolves glared silently, their bodies tense, their stares defiant. Aria sighed inwardly. She could already feel the tension buzzing in the air, a low hum that set her wolf on edge. It prickled at her skin, urging her to keep walking, to avoid the brewing storm entirely. But her path to the arts building cut right through the square, and she wasn't about to take a 10-minute detour just to avoid a scene. She pulled her hood lower and kept her head down, moving swiftly through the gathering crowd. Her goal was simple: stay quiet, avoid drama, and get to class before her professor had another reason to side-eye her tardiness. A sharp voice cut through the chatter, freezing her mid-step. "We need to face the facts," the speaker on stage declared, his voice magnified by a portable mic. "Rogue attacks are increasing, and it's not a coincidence. The more freedom we give them, the more they take. They can't control themselves. How many more lives need to be lost before we admit that?" Aria's shoulders stiffened. Her gaze darted toward the stage, where a human student, a junior politician type in a button-down shirt and self-righteous grin, was gesturing passionately to the crowd. "They want us to believe they're just like us," he continued, pacing across the platform, "that they can integrate into our society. But the truth is, they're predators. Rogues don't just happen. They're the result of a species that can't control its instincts. And yet, we're expected to trust them?" The murmurs in the crowd shifted, a few voices rising in agreement. Others muttered protests under their breath. Aria's jaw tightened, her nails digging into her palms through the fabric of her hoodie. Her wolf stirred, low and restless, agitated by the anger in the air. She shoved the sensation down, burying it beneath a layer of icy control. "Don't react," she told herself. "He's just another loudmouth looking for attention." But it wasn't easy to ignore the way the words sliced through her, sharp and accusatory. She hated how they lumped all wolves together, painting them with the same bloody brush. She hated how no one ever mentioned the systemic discrimination that drove some wolves to break away from packs and turn rogue in the first place. And more than anything, she hated how people like him made her wolf claw at the walls of her restraint, desperate to rise, to defend, to fight. "Not all of us are like that," the shout came from the back of the crowd, cutting through the speaker's rhetoric like a blade. All heads turned toward a young werewolf student, his face flushed with anger, his stance rigid and challenging. "They're rogue wolves. They don't speak for the rest of us," he continued, his voice trembling slightly but strong enough to carry. "You can't judge an entire species based on the actions of a few." The human speaker raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening like he'd been waiting for someone to take the bait. "And how do we tell the difference?" he asked smoothly. "How do we know you won't snap under the pressure one day? You expect us to just trust you?" The crowd rippled with murmurs again, the tension thick enough to choke on. Aria's stomach twisted. She could see the warning signs, the rigid set of the young wolf's shoulders, the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He was teetering on the edge, his wolf bubbling just beneath the surface, agitated by the hostility surrounding him. Her wolf growled softly in the back of her mind, urging her to step in, to do something. Stepping in wouldn't help. It would only make things worse. The young wolf was impulsive, but he wasn't stupid. He'd either back down or lose control, and either way, Aria knew it wasn't her fight to win. She shifted her weight, ready to leave, when the human speaker's next words stopped her cold. Let's not pretend you're any different from them. You're all the same, and sooner or later the world's going to see it for what it is, a dangerous, primal species pretending to be civilized. Aria's fists clenched at her sides, her teeth grinding together. A low, almost imperceptible hum started in her ears, the sound of her wolf pushing back against the tight leash she kept it on. She forced herself to breathe, slow and deep, ignoring the heat rising in her chest. The tension in the square was a tangible thing now, coiling tighter with every second. Around her, the crowd erupted, some in support of the speaker, others in anger, the two sides clashing in a cacophony of voices. The young wolf shouted something back, his defiance drowned out by the noise. Aria turned away, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't do this. She wouldn't let herself get dragged into it. As she walked briskly toward the edge of the square, the weight of the scene clung to her like smoke. She didn't have to look back to know how it would end. Humans would leave feeling righteous. Wolves would leave feeling powerless. And nothing would change. The sharp crackle of a radio broke through the rising chaos, silencing the argument like a whip. Aria's ears pricked at the sound, and she turned her head just in time to see campus security weaving through the crowd, their stiff uniforms and no-nonsense expressions unmistakable. Beside them, two government enforcers flanked the group. The crowd rippled with unease as the enforcers made a beeline for the young werewolf who had spoken up moments earlier. His defiant stance faltered, his bravado cracking just enough to show the fear lurking beneath. "You're coming with us," one of the enforcers barked, his voice clipped and cold. "For what?" the young wolf demanded, his tone defensive but shaky. "I didn't do anything." "Agitation," the enforcer replied. His partner stepped forward, hand resting on the baton at his hip. "You're inciting unrest." The crowd gasped, and Aria's wolf surged to the surface, snarling at the injustice. She gritted her teeth, shoving the instinct down. "This is bullshit," the wolf snapped, taking a step back as the enforcers advanced. His body trembled slightly, his wolf pushing to take control. "I was just talking. I have a right to—" "Calm down," the first enforcer cut in, his tone laced with warning. "You're getting aggressive." "I'm not." The enforcer drew his baton, its tip crackling with a faint electric hum. A crowd member screamed, and the tension in the square exploded. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the students as phones were raised, cameras capturing the scene. The werewolf's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling with barely restrained fury. His eyes flashed golden for the briefest moment, and Aria knew he was losing control. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up. "Stop," she called out, her voice cutting clean through the chaos. The enforcers hesitated, their gazes snapping to her. The young wolf's head jerked in her direction, his expression a mix of surprise and desperation. Aria stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her hands raised in a gesture of calm. "He's not a threat," she said evenly, her tone steady but firm. "You're escalating this. The first enforcer narrowed his eyes. "And who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't want to see this turn into a bigger mess than it already is," she replied. Her wolf prowled beneath her skin, agitated but silent. She focused on the young wolf, meeting his gaze. "They want you to snap," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Don't give them what they're looking for. It's not worth it." His jaw clenched, the golden hue in his eyes flickering and dimming. His breath slowed, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "Stand down," Aria continued, her tone carrying an authority she didn't even know she had. "Walk away." For a moment the wolf seemed torn. Then, with a sharp exhale, he nodded. He lowered his head, taking a deliberate step back. The enforcers exchanged glances, their grip on their weapons tightening, but they didn't make a move to stop him. The crowd began to disperse, the energy in the square cooling as quickly as it had flared. Aria stood still, her heart pounding as she watched the young wolf disappear into the sea of students. Only when the enforcers turned and walked away did she allow herself to breathe. She didn't linger. Pulling her hood lower, she turned and melted back into the crowd, her pulse still racing. From the edge of the square, Evan Cross lowered his camera, his lips quirking into a thoughtful frown. The woman had caught his eye the moment she stepped forward. It wasn't just her boldness, though, to be fair, most wolves would have avoided drawing attention to themselves in a situation like that. No, it was the way she carried herself. Calm, controlled, unshaken by the hostility in the air. That wasn't what he'd expected. He replayed the scene in his mind, analyzing every detail as he scrolled through the photos on his camera. The wolf she'd spoken to had been on the verge of losing it, his primal instincts clawing to the surface. But one look from her, one word, and he'd pulled himself back. Evan's frown deepened. Wolves didn't do that. At least, not according to everything he'd read, seen, and written. Their instincts ruled them, especially in moments of high stress. Yet this woman had not only kept herself in check, but also managed to pull someone else back from the edge. Who the hell was she? He glanced back toward the crowd, searching for her in the throng of students. She was gone. A spark of curiosity flared in his chest, mingling with something he couldn't quite name. He didn't know her story, but he had a feeling it was worth uncovering. And if there was one thing Evan Cross couldn't resist, it was a good story. He slung his camera strap over his shoulder and walked away, his mind already spinning with questions. "That's not what I expected," he thought, his brow furrowing. "She's not like the wolves they talk about. Not at all." He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her, but something told him he'd be seeing her again, and when he did, he'd be ready. Aria's pulse still hadn't settled as she made her way through the quieter side streets, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the campus square. The buzz of energy from the crowd still clung to her, like static electricity that refused to discharge. She tugged her hoodie tighter around her, her thoughts swirling with the echoes of the confrontation. The young wolf's face flashed in her mind, his fear, his anger, the golden glint of his eyes as he teetered on the edge of losing control. She hadn't even known his name, yet for a moment, his instincts had been hers to steady. And then there were the enforcers. Aria's stomach twisted at the memory of their weapons, the cold detachment in their eyes. It wasn't just protocol. It was something darker, something simmering beneath the surface of their authority. They hadn't wanted to defuse the situation. They'd wanted a reason to act. Her wolf stirred uneasily, a low growl vibrating deep within her chest. She shoved it back down, biting the inside of her cheek to ground herself. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not here, not now. "Stupid," she muttered under her breath, weaving through a cluster of students heading to the coffee shop down the street. It was so stupid. Her hood slipped back slightly, and she adjusted it with a sharp tug. The last thing she needed was someone recognizing her. She wasn't even sure why she'd stepped in, just that she couldn't stand there and do nothing while the enforcers baited that poor wolf into ruining his life. But the risk she'd taken, it had been reckless. And yet, for some reason, she couldn't stop herself. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every word, every action, every step she'd taken. She reached a quieter street, her shoulders relaxing as the noise of the square faded behind her. The air here was cooler, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and the faint musk of the city. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, her steps slow. That was too close, she thought. Running a hand through her dark hair, she pulled her hood back completely. Liam's going to kill me if he finds out. Or worse, make it a pack lesson in restraint. Her lips curled in a grim smile at the thought. Liam didn't dole out lectures so much as power plays disguised as wisdom. He'd tell her she was reckless, that she was lucky she hadn't exposed her unique ability. And deep down, she knew he'd be right. If those enforcers, or anyone in the crowd for that matter, had caught a whiff of what she truly was, the weight of her secret settled heavily in her chest, a burden she carried with practiced ease but never without consequence. "Hey!" The sharp voice broke through her thoughts, making her whip her head around. A pair of students, human by their scent, stood huddled near the edge of an alleyway, their faces pale and their eyes wide with unease. "Is everything okay?" Aria asked, her voice firm but calm. They didn't answer, but their wide-eyed stares flicked to the alley. Aria followed their gaze, her instincts sharpening as she caught the faintest sound of movement. Heavy breathing, uneven and ragged. Her wolf went on high alert, muscles coiling beneath her skin. She didn't hesitate. "Go," she told the students, gesturing for them to leave. "Now." They didn't need to be told twice, practically sprinting in the opposite direction. Aria stepped closer to the alley, her senses straining. "Who's there?" she called, her voice low and steady. No answer. Her heart thudded in her chest as she moved deeper into the shadows, the faint outline of a figure coming into focus. It was the young wolf from the square. He was slumped against the brick wall, his chest heaving as though he'd just run a marathon. Sweat slicked his brow, and his eyes, still carrying the faintest glow of gold, snapped to hers as she approached. "Hey," she said softly, crouching in front of him. "You okay?" He flinched at the question, his gaze darting to the entrance of the alley, as if expecting the enforcers to burst in at any moment. "They're gone," Aria assured him. "You're safe." He didn't respond immediately, his breathing still uneven, but he didn't pull away as she reached for his wrist, checking his pulse out of instinct. "You shouldn't have done that," he muttered finally, his voice hoarse. Aria arched a brow. "Done what?" "Done what?" "Stopped them." He met her gaze, and there was something sharp and accusing in his expression. "You think they're just going to let it go? You made yourself a target." Aria shrugged, masking her unease with a wry smirk. "I'll take my chances." He shook his head, the anger in his eyes giving way to something closer to gratitude. "Thanks," he muttered, the word barely audible. "Don't mention it," she said, standing and offering him a hand. "Seriously, don't." He hesitated before taking it, letting her pull him to his feet. As she led him back toward the main street, her wolf settled, quiet and satisfied. For now, the moment had passed, but the weight of what she'd done and the risks she'd taken lingered like a shadow at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As Aria disappeared into the crowd, the rhythmic pounding of her sneakers against the pavement was the only sound she focused on, drowning out the city's hum. Her thoughts churned as she pushed away the memory of the werewolf mother at the checkpoint, her chest tightening with suppressed emotion. Ahead, A gust of wind whipped through the streets, carrying with it the sharp tang of metal, a scent that set her wolf on edge. She slowed, her eyes scanning the shadows instinctively, but saw nothing unusual. Still, a prickle of unease crawled up her spine. She quickened her pace, tightening her hoodie around her face. A figure watched her from across the street, hidden in plain sight among the bustling crowd. His camera hung loosely around his neck, but his sharp gaze followed her every step. Evan Cross lowered his camera, a faint frown tugging at his lips. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew one thing for certain. She was different. And different made for the best stories. Chapter 2. The Journalist's Eye. The cafe was a haven of warmth against the city's brisk autumn chill. Light spilled from antique sconces onto the exposed brick walls, reflecting off shelves crowded with mismatched books and knickknacks. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of cinnamon pastries, creating a cozy atmosphere that hummed with soft conversation and the occasional clatter of dishes. Evan Cross sat tucked in a corner booth, his laptop open in front of him. His long fingers flew over the keyboard, pausing occasionally to scroll through photos from his last assignment. His camera bag sat on the floor at his feet, a constant companion that he never left behind. "Too safe," he muttered under his breath, echoing his editor's latest critique. He scowled at the screen, clicking through images of the protest he'd covered the previous week. Werewolf rights activists had marched through the city, demanding an end to restrictive legislation that monitored their movements and controlled their abilities. The images captured their passion: the raised fists, the defiant banners, the tired but determined faces. The protest hadn't ended peacefully. A rogue wolf had appeared, and in a single violent moment, the event had shifted from a call for equality to a chaotic clash. Evan had been there to capture the fallout. Humans shouting, wolves snarling, and law enforcement deploying tranquilizers to subdue the rogue. It was all sensational, of course. That's what his editor had wanted. Something dramatic, something raw. But Evan couldn't help feeling dissatisfied. He'd grown up hearing the same stories, the same narratives. Werewolves were dangerous. They couldn't be trusted. He wanted more. The truth, not just the spectacle. "They say they want equality," he murmured, clicking to the next photo. "But how do you ignore their instincts?" His voice carried a mix of skepticism and frustration. It wasn't that he believed all werewolves were dangerous. It was that society couldn't afford to pretend instincts didn't matter. Humans were predictable, werewolves less so. It was a pragmatic way of looking at the issue, but it still left a sour taste in his mouth. Evan sat back, running a hand through his dark hair. He wasn't blind to the prejudice that wolves faced, but he also couldn't ignore the fear that drove it. Stories of rogue attacks dominated the news. People saw them as monsters because sometimes they were. And yet, his gaze flicked to the notes he'd jotted in the margins of his last piece, his handwriting angular and rushed. Find the angle, challenge the narrative. The problem was that he hadn't found it yet. His editor had been right. His reporting had become routine, safe. He needed something fresh, something no one else had. The faint murmur of voices outside the cafe broke his concentration. Evan frowned, glancing toward the large front window. The tension in the air shifted, an almost imperceptible hum that made him sit up straighter. Trouble. Evan closed his laptop with a snap, grabbing his camera and sliding it over his shoulder as he stood. The cafe's warmth gave way to the crisp bite of the autumn air as he stepped outside, his boots crunching against the pavement. The noise was coming from a checkpoint across the street. A crowd had gathered, a mix of humans and wolves. Evan's journalist instincts flared, and he moved closer, keeping to the edges of the growing circle. His camera was in his hands before he even realized it, the cool metal familiar and steadying. "Your ID's fake," one of the officers barked, holding up a card and glaring at the wolf. "It's not fake," the wolf protested, his voice tight with desperation. "I'm fine, I swear." The officer ignored him, his tone sharp. "Rogues always say that. Hands where I can see them." The wolf's hands trembled as he raised them, his chest heaving with the effort to stay calm. But Evan didn't miss the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his eyes darted toward the crowd as if searching for an escape. This is where it all goes wrong, Evan thought grimly, raising his camera. He snapped photo after photo, his sharp eye catching every detail. The wolf's trembling hands, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tension in his shoulders. The officers, rigid and watchful, their hands hovering near the tranquilizers clipped to their belts. The humans in the crowd, some murmuring uneasily, others gripping their phones to record the scene. This is what they're afraid of, Evan mused, his stomach twisting as he clicked the shutter. The wolf loses control, and the humans react like they're trained to hunt. The air grew taut, charged with the potential for violence. Evan's finger hovered over the shutter, his breath shallow as he waited for the moment to break. The wolf's chest expanded with a sharp inhale, and his pupils flickered to slits, a sign his instincts were beginning to take over. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," one of the officers said, his voice laced with warning. Evan felt the crowd hold its collective breath. So did he. And then a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and steady as steel. "That's enough." The crowd's unease was palpable, a silent storm waiting for a spark to ignite it. Aria Thorne lingered at the edge, her hoodie pulled low as she watched the confrontation unfold. Her wolf stirred uneasily beneath her skin, sensing the rising tension like a taut bowstring ready to snap. She didn't want to get involved. Stepping in was messy. It drew attention, invited questions, and often came with consequences she couldn't afford. But her wolf didn't care about logic. It clawed at her insides, growling in disapproval, demanding she do something. Her jaw clenched as she watched the werewolf man jerk his hands upward in a panicked gesture. His fear was palpable, sharp enough to taste in the air, and the officers were keyed in on it. Too keyed in. "Don't do this," she muttered under her breath, wishing he could hear her. But he couldn't. His wolf was already too close to the surface, his instincts overpowering reason. The officer closest to him reached for his tranquilizer, and Aria moved. "That's enough." Her voice cut through the tense silence like a blade, low but steady, brimming with authority. It wasn't a shout. She didn't need it to be. It was the kind of tone that demanded attention, made people stop and listen. The officers froze, their hands still hovering near their weapons. The werewolf man turned his wide, startled eyes toward her, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Aria stepped forward, her movements calm and deliberate, keeping her wolf carefully caged. She didn't need to show her fangs to assert control. "He's not a threat," she said, locking eyes with the officer holding the tranquilizer. "Put that down before you make a bad situation worse." The officer frowned, his gaze flicking to her hoodie-covered face. "And who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't want to see you overreact," she replied, her tone smooth but sharp enough to draw blood. "Take a breath, officer. He's scared, not dangerous." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner, but Aria didn't give him a chance to respond. She turned to the werewolf man, who looked as though he might bolt. "You need to calm down," she told him, her voice softening slightly. "You're only making it harder on yourself." For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a rubber band snapping, the tension in the air eased. The werewolf man's shoulders sagged, his breath slowing as he nodded reluctantly. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly thrown by Aria's presence and control. Without waiting for their permission, she turned and started walking away, her pace steady, as if she hadn't just diffused a powder keg waiting to blow. From his spot near the edge of the crowd, Evan Cross lowered his camera slightly, his attention riveted to the woman who had just stepped in. She wasn't what he expected. Most wolves he'd met, especially in tense situations, couldn't hide their instincts. But this one, she was different. Too calm, too confident, too in control. "Who is she?" he murmured, adjusting his lens to snap another photo as she moved. Her face was partially shadowed by her hood, but her posture spoke volumes. Every step she took radiated poise and quiet authority, like she was carrying a power too vast to be contained. Evan's lips curved into a faint frown, curiosity sparking in his chest. She didn't fit the mold of what people expected a wolf to be, and that made her interesting. He snapped a few more shots before the crowd began to disperse, the drama seemingly over. But Evan wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The street was slowly returning to normal, but the tension from the confrontation still lingered, a faint hum beneath the surface. Aria kept her head down as she walked, her shoulders stiff with residual adrenaline. Behind her, Evan lowered his camera and took a step in her direction. He didn't think, he just moved, his instincts kicking in as curiosity propelled him forward. "Hey," he called out. Aria stopped, her spine stiffening as she turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at him over her shoulder. Her hood still obscured most of her face, but he caught the sharp glint of her eyes, narrowed in wary suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone clipped, edged with annoyance. Evan took another step closer, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm Evan Cross," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a journalist." Her lips tightened, and she turned fully to face him. "Not interested," she said flatly, her arms crossing over her chest. He ignored the dismissal, his curiosity outweighing his better judgment. "You handled that situation back there like a pro," he continued. "I don't see that kind of control every day, especially from a wolf." Her jaw twitched, and he caught the faintest flare of her nostrils, as if her wolf was testing his scent. "Nothing happened," she said, her words deliberate and cool. "And I'm not your story." Evan blinked, momentarily thrown by her bluntness. Most people tried to deflect or charm their way out of his questions. She wasn't bothering with either. Before he could respond, she turned on her heel and started walking away, her stride purposeful. "Wait," he began, but she didn't look back. Evan stayed rooted to the spot, watching her retreat into the crowd until she disappeared from view. He felt an odd mix of frustration and intrigue curling in his chest, her words echoing in his mind. "I'm not your story." The hell she wasn't. The cafe had emptied out, its earlier hum of activity replaced by the occasional clink of cups being cleared and the low murmur of staff chatting behind the counter. Outside, the sky had deepened to an inky blue, the city lights flickering to life and casting the street in a warm golden glow. Evan Cross sat alone in his corner booth, his camera resting on the table beside his laptop. The half-finished coffee near his elbow had gone cold, but he ignored it, too absorbed in the images on his screen. He clicked through the photos one by one, his sharp eyes studying each frame with the meticulous attention of a craftsman. Most of the images were of the confrontation, the werewolf man's tense posture, the officer's hands hovering near their tranquilizers, the charged expressions of the crowd. And then there were the ones of her. Evan paused, leaning closer to the screen as he zoomed in on one particular shot. The woman in the hoodie. She was turned slightly away from the camera, her face partially shadowed by the angle of her hood, but her expression, calm, controlled, intense. It wasn't fear or panic he'd captured. It was authority, resolve. She'd looked at the officers like she was the one in charge, her presence enough to diffuse the tension without so much as a raised voice. Evan sat back in his chair, his fingers idly drumming against the edge of his laptop. Most wolves he'd encountered wore their emotions on their sleeves, their instincts bleeding into their every move, but not her. She was different. "Who are you?" he muttered under his breath, clicking through more images of her. She didn't fit the mold of the stories he'd covered before. The wolves who let their tempers flare, who roared when cornered, the ones who confirmed every fear humans had of them. No, she was something else entirely, and that made her interesting. Evan leaned forward again, his mind whirring. He hadn't been lying when he'd told his editor he was looking for a new angle. Something fresh, something unexpected, and he had a feeling she might be exactly what he was searching for. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. He jotted down a single line, the words deliberate and decisive. "Find her." Evan closed his laptop with a sharp snap, a determined spark glinting in his eyes. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered to himself, sliding his camera bag over his shoulder. As he walked out of the cafe, the city buzzed on around him, oblivious to the story he was about to chase. Meanwhile, Aria slipped through the evening streets, her hands tucked deep into her hoodie pockets. Her wolf stirred restlessly, a faint prickling at the back of her neck making her glance over her shoulder. Nothing. She exhaled softly, shaking off the unease and quickening her pace. The last thing she needed tonight was more attention. But attention was already on its way, whether she wanted it or not. Chapter 3. A Chance Encounter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of milk frothing and soft chatter from the tables. The cafe was packed, a mixture of students cramming for exams, professionals pounding away on laptops, and people simply trying to escape the cold drizzle outside. Aria Thorne stood in line at the counter, her hoodie down for once, exposing the cascade of dark hair framing her sharp features. She scanned the menu with casual disinterest, even though she already knew her order. A black coffee, no sugar, and a blueberry muffin she would barely nibble at. Her plan was simple: grab her coffee, avoid eye contact, and get to class unnoticed. She had no desire for small talk or casual encounters. People were a complication, and Aria avoided complications like the plague. The barista called for the next customer, and Aria stepped forward, reaching into her pocket for her wallet. That was when it happened. A sharp jolt to her shoulder sent her coffee cup wobbling in her hand, a small splash of liquid escaping over the rim. Aria snapped her arm back instinctively, holding the cup away from her body like it might detonate. "Seriously," she muttered, glaring at the culprit. The man in question stumbled back, his laptop bag nearly slipping from his shoulder, a camera clutched awkwardly in his other hand. He blinked at her, his face an odd mix of apology and surprise. Then recognition lit his hazel eyes. "Oh, it's you," he blurted, a crooked grin spreading across his face. Aria frowned. "Glad to know I'm so memorable," she deadpanned, grabbing a napkin from the counter and brushing at the droplets of coffee on her sleeve. "Sorry about that," the man said, fumbling for his own napkin. "I was, preoccupied." Aria raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "Preoccupied with running me over?" "No," he said quickly, though his sheepish grin suggested otherwise. "More like preoccupied with not spilling this." He held up his camera as if it were some sacred artifact. She rolled her eyes and resumed wiping at her sleeve. "You've got a real talent for ruining mornings. And you've got a real talent for diffusing angry mobs," he countered, without missing a beat, the grin never leaving his face. "We all have our gifts." Aria paused, her sharp gaze narrowing on him. "Wait, you're the guy from yesterday," she said slowly, recognition dawning. "The journalist," he said, a slight tilt to his head. "Evan Cross." Her lips quirked, a ghost of a smirk teasing the corner. "Too bad your gift isn't walking in a straight line, Evan Cross." The way she said his name with that dry, sarcastic edge made his grin widen. He wasn't used to people brushing him off so easily, and he found it oddly refreshing. Evan gestured to the counter. "Let me buy you another coffee to make up for it." "Buy me another coffee and I'll spill that one on you," Aria shot back, smirking fully now. Evan laughed, shaking his head. "Noted." As Aria turned back to the barista to collect her order, Evan watched her, that spark of curiosity from the day before burning even brighter now. There was something about her, a confidence, a sharpness, that intrigued him. And if her sarcasm was anything to go by, she wasn't going to make his curiosity easy to satisfy. For her part, Aria was already thinking about how to avoid him from now on. This morning had been annoying enough without a nosy journalist trailing her. Still, as she grabbed her coffee and turned toward the exit, she couldn't help but toss a parting shot over her shoulder. "Try not to knock anyone else over on your way out, paparazzi." Evan chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement as he called after her. "Only if you stop scaring cops for fun." She didn't turn around, but he caught the faintest shake of her head as she pushed through the door and disappeared into the drizzle. For a moment, Evan just stood there, still grinning to himself. She might have thought she was brushing him off, but she'd done the opposite. Now he was hooked. The coffee shop buzzed with activity, the hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. Aria had claimed a small corner table, her notebook open in front of her as she pretended to read through the neatly scribbled notes. The truth was, her mind wasn't on the page. It was on the persistent gaze burning into the side of her head. She sighed inwardly. A few feet away, Evan Cross sat at his table, his camera bag propped beside him, and his coffee growing cold as he stared at her with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and amusement. "She looks like she'd bite my head off if I said the wrong thing," he thought, drumming his fingers on the table. "Or maybe even if I said the right thing. Either way, worth it." Evan wasn't used to people brushing him off, especially not women. Most either tolerated his questions or found his charm disarming, but not her. Aria was a brick wall, and she didn't care if he ran face first into it. The thought made him grin. Finally, Aria snapped, slamming her notebook shut with a sharp thwap. "Do I have something on my face, or are you just bad at being subtle?" Evan chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Okay, you caught me." "Caught you staring like a creep?" she said flatly, her sharp tone undercut by the amused glint in her eyes. "Like a journalist?" he corrected, leaning forward slightly. "I was just wondering if you always go around bossing cops around, or if yesterday was a special occasion." "Yesterday was me minding my own business," she replied, her voice laced with a warning edge. "You should try it sometime. It's nice." Evan laughed again, the sound rich and warm. "Fair point. But if I minded my own business, I'd be terrible at my job." Aria opened her notebook again, deliberately ignoring him. Evan wasn't discouraged. He picked up his coffee, walked over to her table, and slid into the chair across from her without so much as an invitation. Aria's head shot up, her eyes narrowing. "Are you kidding me?" "Nope," Evan said, setting his cup down with a decisive thud. "Humor me." Her brow lifted in a way that said she was more likely to humor a hungry crocodile. "You were amazing back there," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "Calm, collected, and clearly in control. What's your secret?" Aria leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Caffeine and a healthy fear of stupidity." Evan grinned, delighted. "You're deflecting." "Yeah, because you're annoying," she shot back, her tone dry as desert sand. Evan wasn't fazed. "I've been called worse. Comes with the territory." Aria closed her notebook again, slowly, as if giving him one last chance to back off. Her wolf stirred faintly, not from aggression, but from the unsettling persistence in the human sitting across from her. Most people turned tail the moment she sharpened her tone, but Evan didn't even flinch. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Nope," he said, leaning back with a satisfied look. "I'm annoyingly persistent. Ask anyone." "Good to know," Aria muttered, standing abruptly and sliding her notebook into her bag. Evan stayed seated, watching her with an amused smile as she slung the bag over her shoulder and stepped away from the table. "See you around," he called after her, his tone almost playful. Aria didn't reply, though she did shoot him a look over her shoulder that could have frozen molten lava. Evan just grinned. "This is going to be fun." The rain had let up, leaving the streets glossy with puddles that mirrored the neon glow of shop signs. The air smelled fresh and damp, a brief reprieve before the next wave of clouds rolled in. Aria walked briskly down the sidewalk, her bag slung over one shoulder, the hood of her jacket pulled up against the chill. She didn't bother looking back. If she walked fast enough, maybe she could leave the coffee shop. And a certain persistent journalist firmly behind her. She was halfway down the block when she heard the sound of footsteps jogging to catch up with her. Her shoulders tense. "What now?" she asked flatly, not bothering to turn around. "I figured you might need a bodyguard," came Evan's voice as he fell into step beside her. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket, his casual tone laced with amusement. "Or at least someone to carry your coffee." Aria shot him a sidelong glance, her brow arching. "Are you always this charming, or did I win the lottery?" "You won the lottery," he said with a straight face, nodding solemnly. "The grand prize is me being a pain in your ass for the foreseeable future." Aria snorted. She couldn't help it. "Fantastic. Just what I needed." Evan grinned, clearly encouraged by her reaction. "Don't worry, I come with perks. Good conversation, sharp wit, and occasionally I take really flattering photos." She stopped abruptly, forcing him to skid to a halt to avoid running into her. "Listen, paparazzi," she said, poking a finger at his chest, her tone sharp but tinged with humor. "I don't do interviews, I don't do small talk, and I definitely don't do whatever this is." Evan held up his hands in mock surrender, his expression unrepentant. "Noted. So, dinner later?" Aria blinked at him, momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head with an exasperated laugh. "Unbelievable." "Thank you," he said, flashing her a boyish grin that was entirely too self-satisfied. Despite her better judgment, or perhaps because Evan refused to leave, Aria found herself walking alongside him. The soft sounds of their footsteps on the wet pavement punctuated their silence, though Evan seemed determined to fill it. "Well, did you step in yesterday?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as he glanced sideways at her. Aria shrugged, keeping her expression neutral. Seemed like the right thing to do. "You're a terrible liar," he replied, his grin softening the accusation. Her lips twitched. "And you're a terrible conversationalist. Yet here we are." He laughed, the sound light and easy. "Fair enough. But seriously, you didn't have to get involved. Most people wouldn't have." Aria's stride faltered, just slightly, but enough for her wolf to stir uneasily. She hated being cornered, even verbally. She stuffed her hands into her pockets, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Evan's grin faded, replaced by a more thoughtful expression. "Because I think there's more to you than you're letting on." Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face calm. "Well, lucky for you, I'm not your mystery to solve." They reached the entrance to campus, and Aria stopped, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were sharp, but there was something else in her expression, something guarded. "And that's your problem, not mine," she said firmly. Evan's grin returned, though it was softer this time, less teasing. "Not yet," he said, taking a step back. "But I have a feeling it's going to be." Aria rolled her eyes and turned away, heading toward the main building without another word. She refused to look back, even as her wolf whispered that he was still watching her. Evan stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching her retreating figure with a mix of amusement and intrigue. He couldn't help the smile tugging at his lips. This is going to be interesting. Aria walked away, her strides confident and purposeful, the damp breeze tugging at her hair as she pulled her hoodie back over her head. She didn't glance back, not once. It was the kind of exit that screamed, "I couldn't care less what you think." But Evan wasn't buying it. Standing at the entrance to campus, he crossed his arms and tilted his head, watching her disappear into the crowd of students. His camera bag bumped against his hip as he shifted his weight, the grin tugging at his lips growing wider. "Game on," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with both amusement and determination. Evan couldn't remember the last time someone had shut him down so thoroughly, or so entertainingly. Most people either rolled over under his charm or, at the very least, pretended to. But her? She'd handed him his ego on a silver platter and hadn't even broken a sweat doing it, and now he was hooked. As he turned to leave, Evan pulled out his notebook and jotted down a quick reminder. Find out who the hell she is, and how she makes sarcasm sound like an art form. He chuckled to himself as he tucked the notebook away. This wasn't just a story anymore. Chapter 4. A Line in the Sand. The campus quad buzzed with life, students weaving through each other like bees in a hive. Laughter and snippets of conversation blended into a soundtrack of youth and ambition, undercut by the occasional rustle of leaves as a crisp autumn breeze swept through the space. Aria Thorne perched on a low stone wall near the center of the quad, her coffee cup balanced precariously on her knee as she scrolled through her phone. Her posture was deceptively casual, but her sharp gaze flicked over the crowd every so often, a predator's instinct for spotting trouble. She was in full blend-in mode, but something about her quiet authority set her apart. Evan Cross spotted her from across the quad and couldn't help the grin that tugged at his lips. She wasn't an easy woman to miss, not with that aura of quiet intensity. Slinging his camera bag over his shoulder, he crossed the quad with an exaggerated nonchalance that made him look more like a bad actor than a smooth journalist. "Funny running into you here," he said, stopping in front of her and rocking back on his heels. Aria didn't even glance up. "Funny how that works when you follow someone." Evan clutched his chest, feigning a dramatic wound. "Ouch. Accusations right out of the gate. You wound me, Thorne." "Good," she muttered, still scrawling. Unfazed, he plopped down on the wall beside her, resting his elbows on his knees as he leaned forward. "This isn't stalking, this is fate. Like finding $20 in your jacket pocket or your favorite show getting rid for another season." Aria finally deigned to look at him, arching a single, unimpressed brow. "You're more like the gum stuck to someone's shoe. Persistent, annoying, and impossible to get rid of." Evan chuckled, clapping a hand to his chest again. "Wow, just wow. Here I thought we were making progress." "We were," she said flatly, taking a deliberate sip of her coffee. Then she added, "Until you opened your mouth." Evan laughed outright at that, the sound earning a few curious glances from nearby students. "You've got a hell of a way with words, you know that?" "I try," she said dryly, turning her attention back to her phone. Evan studied her for a moment, his amusement fading slightly as he caught the faint tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped her cup just a little too tightly. Beneath the sarcasm and sharp wit, there was something guarded about her, something that made him all the more curious. "You're good at this, you know," he said after a pause. She glanced at him sideways. "Good at what?" "Dodging questions, shutting people out." Aria set her coffee down on the wall beside her and fixed him with a steady look. "It's a survival skill," she said simply. "Yeah?" Evan leaned in slightly, his tone shifting to something softer, less playful. What exactly are you trying to survive? Her eyes flicked away, scanning the quad as though she were searching for an escape route. Nosy journalists, for starters, she said, her tone lighter but edged with warmth. Evan didn't take the bait. Come on, Thorn. Humor me. You clearly don't fit into the usual mold. And don't tell me you're just another college student, because we both know that's not true. Her wolf stirred uneasily beneath her skin, its presence a quiet reminder of the secret she kept buried deep. She exhaled slowly, forcing it down, and turned back to him with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe I just like being mysterious, she said lightly. Or maybe you're hiding something, Evan countered, his gaze sharp but not unkind. Her wolf prickling at the subtle challenge in his tone. She was used to people prying. It came with the territory of being both wolf and human in a divided world. But Evan wasn't just prying, he was digging. You're wasting your time, she said finally, her voice colder now. There's nothing to find. Evan tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. You're a terrible liar, Thorn, he said with a faint smile. Maybe, she said, standing abruptly and grabbing her coffee, but I'm really good at walking away. With that, she turned on her heel and strode across the quad, her steps quick and deliberate. Evan watched her go, his lips curving into a slow smile. She might think she'd shut him down, but all she'd done was fan the flames of his curiosity. Game on, Thorn, he muttered under his breath, already plotting his next move. The shaded path on campus was quieter than the bustling quad, the low rustle of leaves blending with the distant chatter of students. Aria Thorn strode purposefully toward her next class, her bag slung over her shoulder, her focus fixed ahead. Evan Cross, however, had no intention of making her journey a solitary one. He fell into step beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. His stride was easy, unhurried, but there was a deliberate intent in the way his eyes flicked to her, taking in every detail of her expression and posture. So, he began, his voice light and conversational, why don't you tell me about yourself? Aria's gaze didn't waver from the path ahead. I'm allergic to nosy journalists. Good thing I'm not nosy, Evan shot back without missing a beat. I prefer the term investigative. Aria finally glanced at him, her expression flat, but her tone laced with dry humor. Good thing I'm not interested. Evan grinned. He liked her sharp edges, even when they were pointed at him. You're good at dodging questions, I'll give you that, he said. But you're not giving me much to work with here. Maybe you should work on minding your own business instead, Aria replied smoothly. Maybe, Evan said, his grin widening. But where's the fun in that? Aria picked up her pace slightly, as if sheer speed might shake him, but Evan matched her stride effortlessly. Come on, he pressed, his tone lighter now, almost teasing. You can't be this secretive all the time. Don't you ever get tired of keeping people at arm's length? Aria's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Her wolf stirred faintly, a quiet growl in the back of her mind that mirrored her irritation. Don't you ever get tired of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? Not really, Evan admitted, his grin taking on a mischievous edge. It's kind of my thing. Aria stopped abruptly, forcing him to halt mid-step to avoid running into her. She turned to face him fully, crossing her arms. Why do you care? She demanded, her tone sharper now. Why are you so interested in what I do or don't say? What's your angle? Evan's smile faltered, his expression softening. No angle, he said quietly. Just curiosity. Aria snorted, unimpressed. Curiosity kills cats, and journalists, if they're not careful. He laughed at that, the sound warm and rich. Good thing I'm not easily scared. Her eyes narrowed. You should be. Heaven's humor faded as he caught the flicker of something raw in her expression, something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. For the first time he hesitated, his easy confidence faltering. "I'm not trying to push you," he said, his voice quieter now. I want to understand." "Understand what?" Aria asked, her tone brittle. "Why I stepped in at the checkpoint? Why I don't like being interrogated? Why I don't trust people who can't take a hint?" "Maybe all of that," Evan admitted. "Or maybe just you." Her wolf stirred again, not from anger this time, but from the uneasy awareness that he wasn't lying. He wasn't like the other humans she'd dealt with, those who either feared her or tried to use her. Evan was persistent, yes, but there was a strange sincerity in his persistence, a genuine desire to know her that she didn't know how to handle. "Aria, I'm not your story." "Maybe not," Evan said, falling into step beside her again. "But you're definitely interesting." Aria didn't respond. She couldn't, not without risking him seeing too much, so she focused on walking, on the rhythmic sound of her boots against the pavement, and on the firm reminder to herself that letting him in was a mistake she couldn't afford to make. The shaded path stretched ahead, dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. Aria's boots scuffed against the pavement as she abruptly spun on her heel, cutting off her own retreat. She marched to a nearby bench and sat down with enough force to make it clear she was done playing this game. She dropped her bag onto the bench beside her and glared up at Evan, who hovered awkwardly a few feet away. "Fine," she snapped, crossing her arms. "You want to ask questions? Go ahead. Get it out of your system so you can leave me alone." Evan blinked, momentarily thrown by her sudden capitulation. For a man who always had a quip ready, he found himself surprisingly unprepared. Okay," he said, recovering quickly as he moved to sit on the bench a respectful distance from her. Aria raised an eyebrow. "This is the part where you start talking, genius." Evan chuckled, his confidence returning. "Why did you step in at the checkpoint?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Aria exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting away. "I told you. It felt like the right thing to do." "And I told you you're a terrible liar," Evan countered, though his grin had softened. Her jaw tightened and she looked down at her hands, the familiar restlessness of her wolf stirring beneath her skin. She hated being cornered, hated the way he was watching her, like he could see past all the carefully constructed walls she'd spent years building. "Why do you care so much?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than before. Evan's grin faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression that made him seem older than his years. "Because you're different," he said simply. "You didn't just stand there and watch like everyone else. You took control. You made things better." Aria shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the coffee cup cradled in her hands. "It wasn't a big deal," she muttered. "It was to him." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they had any right to be. The noise of the campus had faded, the crowd of students thinning as the first classes of the day began. The path felt quieter now, almost intimate, the kind of stillness that made it harder to avoid the truth. Aria lifted her head, her sharp green eyes meeting Evan's. "For you really don't know when to quit, do you?" she said, but the words lacked their usual bite. Instead, her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Evan's grin returned, quick and easy. "Not when it comes to you." Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe even understanding. But before either of them could linger in that moment, she stood abruptly, her walls snapping back into place with practiced efficiency. "Well, good luck with that," she said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "I've got somewhere to be." Evan stayed seated, watching her go with a lingering smile, his elbow resting on the back of the bench. "See you around, Thorn," he called after her. She didn't look back, but the way her shoulders tensed made him think she'd heard him loud and clear. As her figure disappeared down the path, Evan leaned back against the bench, his thoughts already racing. She was an enigma, and every time he thought he'd made progress, she closed herself off again. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. As Aria disappeared down the path, her silhouette dissolving into the scattered sunlight filtering through the trees, Evan stayed where he was, perched on the bench. His elbow rested on the backrest, his fingers tapping absently against the wood as he watched her go. A slow grin crept across his face, more thoughtful than triumphant. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd been expecting when he followed her. More biting sarcasm, maybe a well-placed threat. But she'd given him more than that, just enough vulnerability to intrigue him, and just enough resistance to make him want to keep pushing. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his leather-bound notebook and flipped it open to a blank page. The pen in his hand felt comfortable, familiar, as he jotted down a single line. "There's something she's not telling me. Keep digging." The words sat on the page, stark and deliberate, a promise to himself as much as a plan. Evan leaned back against the bench, clicking the pen closed with a satisfied snap. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered under his breath, his grin widening as his mind raced ahead. Already, for the first time in a long while, the story wasn't just about the work. It was personal now. Chapter 5. Lines Blur. The cafe was quieter now, its usual bustling energy replaced by a muted calm. The lights were softer, glowing faintly against the brick walls, and the handful of customers scattered across the room spoke in low murmurs. The only consistent sounds were the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and the clink of cups being set down on saucers. Aria Thorne sat in a corner booth, her hood pulled up as though to shield her from the world. A steaming mug of coffee sat untouched in front of her, and a textbook lay open next to her notebook, where a blank page stared back at her. Her pen tapped absently against the table, her wolf pacing restlessly beneath her skin. It wasn't the kind of unease she could easily explain. It was an itch at the back of her mind, a feeling that something or someone was closing in. The door chimed, and her instincts kicked in before her brain could catch up. Her shoulders stiffened, her senses sharpening as her gaze flicked toward the entrance. And there he was. Evan Cross strolled in like he owned the place, his easy grin firmly in place, and his camera bag slung over one shoulder. Aria groaned inwardly. She'd been hoping to avoid him, but apparently the universe had other plans. His gaze swept the cafe before landing on her, and his grin widened. Of course it did. He made a beeline for her table, ignoring the handful of other empty seats scattered around the room. "What, do you live here now?" Aria muttered as he reached her booth. Evan slid into the seat across from her, setting his bag down beside him like he belonged there. "I could ask you the same thing," he countered. Aria's eyes narrowed. "You're like a stray cat that keeps showing up on my doorstep." "Stray cats are charming," Evan replied, resting his chin on his hand. "And persistent, two of my best qualities." "I'm working," Aria said pointedly, gesturing to her open book. Evan leaned forward slightly, clearly unbothered. "Multitask. You can tell me your life story while you study." Aria snorted, leaning back in her seat. "I don't have a life story. I just appeared fully formed one day to ruin the lives of nosy journalists." "And you're doing a stellar job of it," Evan quipped, his grin widening. Aria shook her head, her lips twitching in spite of herself. "But seriously," Evan continued, his tone turning more curious, "you don't think it's strange that I keep running into you?" "I think it's annoying," Aria said flatly, flipping a page in her textbook without actually reading it. "Annoying, but not strange," he pressed. She sighed, finally looking up at him. "If you're trying to prove that you're the center of the universe, you're failing spectacularly." Evan laughed at that, the sound warm and disarming, but there was a spark in his eyes that told her he wasn't just here to trade sarcastic quips. Aria shifted in her seat, suddenly feeling the weight of his gaze. Her wolf stirred again, that familiar prickling sensation crawling up her spine. "What do you want, Cross?" she asked. Evan's grin softened, and for a moment, he almost looked serious. "Maybe I just like your company," he said. Aria raised an eyebrow. "You don't even know me." "Not yet," he admitted, his tone light but with an undertone that felt heavier. "But I'd like to." The words hung between them, heavier than the playful banter that had preceded them. Aria's instinct was to deflect, to brush him off with another sarcastic remark, but for once she found herself at a loss for words. Her wolf didn't like the way he was looking at her, like he was trying to unravel her, one layer at a time. But she didn't hate it either. "Good luck with that," she said finally, her tone sharp enough to close the door on the conversation, but not so sharp that it slammed shut. Evan's grin returned, slow and deliberate, like he knew he'd won some small victory. "Oh, I don't need luck," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Just persistence, and I've got plenty of that." Aria rolled her eyes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this time he might actually mean it. The cafe hummed quietly, the soft murmur of conversations blending with the low grind of the espresso machine. The large front window framed the street outside, where the city's rhythm pulsed steadily. But it wasn't the usual bustle of foot traffic or the blur of passing cars that caught Aria's attention. It was the government checkpoint set up just beyond the cafe. 2 officers stood at the barricade, their crisp uniforms stark against the dull gray of the street. Beside them, 2 werewolves, a wiry teenager and a stocky middle-aged man, stood rigid. Aria's coffee mug hovered just below her lips as her sharp eyes narrowed. The officers were running the usual protocol, IDs first, then the quick scan of wrists for the telltale suppressant patches. The teenager shifted uneasily, his hands clenching and unclenching as the officer scrutinized his ID a little too long. Her wolf stirred inside her, restless and edgy, clawing at her resolve. She'd been that teenager once, standing there while someone in a uniform decided whether or not she was a threat. She could feel his fear as if it were her own, sharp and jagged. She clenched her jaw and took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening on the handle of her mug. Evan, seated across from her, caught the subtle change in her demeanor. His easy grin faded as he tilted his head, watching her with growing curiosity. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than before, edged with concern. Aria didn't answer immediately. She forced herself to set the mug down, but her gaze flicked back to the scene outside. The officers were now speaking to the middle-aged man, their expressions unreadable but their body language rigid. "Just enjoying the view," she said finally, though her tone was clipped, her words almost mechanical. Evan followed her gaze, his own brow furrowing as he registered the checkpoint and the scene unfolding there. "Doesn't seem like it," he said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. Aria exhaled slowly, leaning back in her seat as she tore her gaze away from the window. "You're really bad at leaving things alone, aren't you?" "I prefer the term persistent," Evan replied, though his usual grin didn't quite reach his eyes this time. He glanced back at the checkpoint. "What's the deal out there anyway? This kind of thing happen a lot?" Aria's eyes flicked toward the window again, her wolf bristling at the sight of the teenager being gestured toward a waiting vehicle. She knew the script by heart. Expired suppressant patch, flagged as non-compliant, probable fine or detainment until a new patch could be administered. The official term was procedure. She preferred to call it what it was, harassment. "Depends who you ask," she said, her voice low. "Okay," Evan said, sitting up straighter. "I'll bite." "If I ask you?" She shot him a look, her expression unreadable. "Then I'd say it's just another day." Evan didn't miss the bitterness in her voice, the way her fingers tapped against the edge of the table as though she was barely keeping herself in check. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You've dealt with this before," he guessed, his tone more serious now. Aria's lips tightened, her wolf growling faintly in the back of her mind. She hated how easily he'd read her, hated even more that he was right. "Everyone's dealt with it," she said, her tone deliberately neutral. "It's just the way things are." Evan frowned, his gaze darting back to the window. The officers were now speaking into their radios. The teenager slumped against the car, his posture defeated. Evan raised an eyebrow. "You don't think there's something off about that?" Aria's eyes darkened as she met his gaze. "What I think doesn't matter. That's how this system works. They decide what's off. They decide who fits and who doesn't." Evan's curiosity sharpened, a journalist's instinct kicking in. "And you're okay with that?" "No," she said sharply, her wolf flaring at the implication. "But unless you've got a way to tear the whole thing down, talking about it doesn't do much." Evan's gaze softened slightly as he studied her. There was a weight to her words, something deeper than frustration, something personal. "You sound like you've got a story there," he said carefully. Aria leaned back, her expression closing off. "I don't have a story. I just have a lot of experience keeping my head down." Evan tilted his head, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. He could feel the tension radiating off her, but he didn't know if it was anger, fear, or something else entirely. "Probably all three. Keeping your head down doesn't suit you," he said finally, his voice quiet. Aria stilled, her wolf growling again, louder this time. She stood abruptly, grabbing her bag and slinging it over her shoulder. "Thanks for the coffee talk, Cross," she said, her tone cool. "But I've got things to do." Evan didn't try to stop her as she walked away, but he watched her go, his mind already working. He glanced back out the window, his jaw tightening as the officers drove away with the werewolves in tow. He didn't know exactly what he was stepping into with Aria, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever her story was, it was bigger than she wanted him to believe, and he wasn't letting it go. The tension outside the cafe was palpable, bleeding into the quiet atmosphere inside. Aria's gaze was fixed on the scene beyond the window, her coffee forgotten as her wolf paced uneasily within her. The teenager, a wiry boy no older than 16, stood stiffly as an officer grabbed his arm, his ID card clenched in his other hand. His jaw worked as though he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Beside him, the middle-aged man, a father or an uncle maybe, held out his own ID in a placating gesture. "His suppressant patch is expired," one of the officers said, loud enough to be heard through the glass. "He's out of compliance." The teenager flinched, yanking his arm back when the officer reached for him again. "Don't touch him like that," the older man said sharply, stepping between them. His voice was steady, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. The officer shoved him aside with a curt order to "stay out of it," sending him stumbling back into the side of the checkpoint barricade. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, unease spreading like wildfire. Inside the cafe, Aria's fists clenched beneath the table, her wolf bristling with the need to act. Her instincts screamed at her to do something, to step in before things escalated further. But her rational side, the side that had learned the hard way that getting involved came with consequences, kept her rooted to her seat. Her jaw tightened, and she dropped her gaze to the table, breathing slowly through her nose in an attempt to rein in the restless energy bubbling under her skin. Across from her, Evan was already moving. He pulled his camera from his bag and began snapping photos through the window, his focus sharp and unyielding. But even as he worked, his eyes flicked to Aria, taking in the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes refused to meet his. "You're dying to get involved," he said softly, his voice low enough not to draw attention from the other patrons. Aria shook her head, the movement stiff. "It's not my problem," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her struggle to believe her own words. Evan lowered his camera slightly, studying her. "Doesn't seem like you believe that," he murmured. Her gaze snapped to his, a sharp look that could have cut glass. "I can't fix the world, Cross," she said flatly, "and I'm not going to try." Outside, the confrontation ended with a disappointing inevitability. The teenager and the older man were escorted into a waiting vehicle, their postures slumped in defeat. The officers moved efficiently, their expressions devoid of empathy, as they sealed the car doors and returned to their posts. Inside the cafe, the tension lingered like a storm cloud, crackling just beneath the surface. The patrons whispered among themselves, their conversations hushed but full of judgment. Aria stared down at her coffee, the liquid rippling faintly from the tremor in her hands. Her wolf was still restless, prowling and growling in the back of her mind, but she forced herself to stay calm, to appear unaffected. Evan, for once, didn't push. He waited, watching her with a patience she hadn't expected. He could see she was on the verge of saying something, and he didn't want to break the moment. Finally she spoke, her voice low and edged with something raw. "You can take 100 photos like that, and it won't change anything." Evan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Maybe not," he said, "but at least it forces people to see it. That's a start." Aria's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Seeing isn't the problem," she muttered. "It's what people do with what they see." The weight of her words settled heavily between them, and for a moment, Evan was at a loss. He was good at reading people, at picking apart their words and their expressions to find the truth beneath, but Aria, she was a fortress. Every time he thought he'd found a crack, she slammed the door shut. "You've dealt with this before, haven't you?" he asked softly, his tone careful. "That's why you're so pissed off." Aria's eyes flicked to his, sharp and guarded, but she didn't immediately shut him down. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment, her wolf stirring uneasily under the weight of his scrutiny. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally, but the bite in her tone was weaker than before. Evan leaned back, his lips curving into a faint, almost sad smile. "Maybe not," he said. "But I'm starting to." Aria's gaze dropped back to her coffee, her fingers tightening around the mug. She didn't reply. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, even when neither of them said a word. And for the first time, Evan wondered if breaking down Aria's walls wasn't just going to be difficult, it was going to cost him more than he'd anticipated. The cafe's once cozy atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, a tension that hung in the air like storm clouds refusing to break. The quiet murmur of other patrons faded into the background as Aria and Evan sat across from each other, the space between them charged with unspoken truths. Evan leaned back in his seat, his fingers loosely clasped around his coffee cup. His gaze stayed fixed on her, contemplative and unwavering. "You're right," he said finally, his voice quieter now, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I don't know you, but I'd like to." Aria's head tilted slightly, her sharp green eyes narrowing. For a brief moment, she didn't respond, letting the words hang between them. Then, without warning, she stood, her movements abrupt but not hurried. "That's your problem, not mine," she said, her tone flat, devoid of the sarcasm she usually wielded so well. Evan's jaw tightened, the flicker of frustration breaking through his otherwise calm demeanor. "Why do you keep shutting me out?" he asked, his voice firm but not loud. There was no humor in it this time, no playful edge to soften the words. "I'm not the enemy here, Aria." She stopped, her bag slung over her shoulder, her fingers curling around the strap. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Because it's easier," she said quietly. The words were calm, but they carried an edge, like a blade honed too sharp. Evan opened his mouth, but before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her boots clicking softly against the floor. Evan watched her go, his gaze tracking her as she pushed open the cafe door and stepped out onto the street. She didn't look back, her shoulders stiff and her stride purposeful. The weight of her words settled over him, heavy and lingering. He didn't chase her this time. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was that he knew it wouldn't make a difference. And before she feet hit the street around his knob, he kissed and watched her go. He wasn't going, he said, stepping out of the door. Chapter 6. The Alpha's Pressure. The pack's headquarters loomed on the edge of the city, a rustic yet imposing structure that seemed to straddle two worlds. Its dark timber frame and tall windows gave it a regal air, while the dense woods surrounding it served as a reminder of the primal strength it represented. Aria Thorne stood outside the heavy oak door to Liam's office, her hand hovering just inches from the brass handle. Her wolf prowled within her, agitated, sensing the tension that awaited inside. Muffled voices reached her ears, sharp and commanding, and she recognized one of them as Liam's. She exhaled sharply, her breath fogging faintly in the cool hallway air. Whatever this was about, it wasn't going to be good. Squaring her shoulders, she knocked twice. "Come in," Liam's deep voice called, steady and authoritative. Aria pushed the door open and stepped inside. Liam's office was exactly as she remembered it, a blend of power and tradition. Dark leather furniture surrounded a polished mahogany desk, the surface neatly organized except for a single stack of papers. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents ranging from history to strategy to law. The faint scent of pine and musk permeated the room, a scent uniquely tied to Liam, the Alpha. Liam sat behind the desk, his sharp blue eyes lifting to meet hers as she entered. He didn't say a word at first, simply studying her with a gaze that always made her feel like he was seeing too much. Aria resisted the urge to fidget under his scrutiny, keeping her expression calm and neutral. "You're late," he said, his tone calm but laced with authority. "You didn't say it was urgent," she replied evenly. Liam gestured toward the chair in front of his desk, but Aria remained standing, her arms loosely crossed. Liam leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's always urgent when it comes to you, Aria." Liam wasted no time cutting to the heart of the matter. "You've been holding back," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The pack needs strong leaders, and you have the potential to be one." Aria's wolf bristled at the implication, her instincts flaring. She kept her tone neutral, though unwilling to let him see how much the comment irritated her. "I'm doing fine where I am." "Fine isn't enough," Liam said sharply, leaning forward. His piercing gaze pinned her in place. "You've got a presence, Aria. Wolves follow you without even realizing it. You could be a beta, or more." Aria crossed her arms, her stance firm. "I didn't ask for that kind of responsibility." Liam raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "Responsibility comes with strength. You don't get to choose when to use it." "I'm choosing now," she countered, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm not interested in playing politics or enforcing rules. I want to live my own life." Liam's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue immediately. Instead, he stood, his imposing frame towering over her as he moved around the desk. His presence filled the room, the weight of his authority pressing down like a physical force. "You're not a lone wolf, Aria," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. "You belong to this pack, whether you like it or not, and the pack needs you." Her wolf growled softly in the back of her mind, a mix of defiance and unease. She clenched her fists at her sides, struggling to keep it in check. "I've given enough to this pack," she said finally, her voice tight. "Isn't that enough for you?" Liam's expression softened for a fleeting moment, but the resolve in his gaze didn't waver. "You've given a lot," he admitted. "But you're capable of so much more. The pack sees it. I see it. The only person who doesn't is you." Aria's heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she shook her head, her voice low. "I don't need anyone's approval, Liam. Least of all yours." The Alpha's expression hardened again, though he didn't lash out. "We'll see how long that attitude holds," he said. "But one way or another, you'll realize that this isn't just about you. It never was." Aria turned on her heel and walked out before he could say anything else, her wolf growling softly in her chest the entire way. Liam's voice lingered in her mind as she left the headquarters, the weight of his words heavier than she wanted to admit. The hallway outside Liam's office was quiet, but the faint hum of voices carried through the air, drawing Aria's attention. She pulled her hoodie over her head as she stepped into the corridor, determined to make a quick exit. Then she heard them. "We can't keep ignoring what's happening out there," a voice said sharply. It belonged to Lucas, one of the pack's senior betas, his tone brimming with urgency. "The council's restrictions are getting worse, and the pack's losing patience." Aria slowed her steps, her wolf stirring with curiosity. "Liam's working on it," another beta replied, his voice quieter but edged with doubt. "But the humans aren't giving him much to work with." "Doesn't matter," Lucas snapped. "We can't keep playing nice while they tighten the leash. The pack needs action, not more diplomacy." Aria's fingers curled into fists at her sides as she moved past the corner where they stood. Their words stuck with her, echoing in her mind as she headed for the exit. The Unified Council's restrictions weren't new, but they had become more oppressive in recent months. For werewolves, daily life was a balancing act between complying with regulations and keeping their instincts in check. Fines for expired suppressant patches, mandatory ID checks, and relentless surveillance were just the tip of the iceberg. The frustration Lucas voiced wasn't new to her ears. She'd heard it whispered in pack meetings and growled in quiet corners, but this time it felt louder, closer, like a storm building on the horizon. As she pushed open the front door of the headquarters, the cool evening air hit her face, and she breathed deeply, trying to shake off the heaviness pressing on her chest. The walk to her car was a blur, her thoughts tangled and turbulent. The pack's frustration mirrored her own in more ways than she cared to admit, but where they wanted action, she wanted distance. The weight of expectation hung over her like a shadow. Stepping into a leadership role might mean addressing the council, confronting the restrictions head-on, but it also meant scrutiny on her abilities, her choices, and the secret she'd kept hidden for years. Aria clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms as she reached her car. The idea of stepping into Liam's world of politics and negotiations felt suffocating, a cage disguised as duty. "I'm not the answer they're looking for," she murmured to herself as she slid into the driver's seat. Her wolf growled low in disagreement, but she ignored it, starting the car and heading home. A dim glow of streetlight spilled through the window of Aria's apartment, casting faint shadows across the walls. The faint hum of city traffic outside was the only sound breaking the silence as she paced the small living room. Her wolf was restless, prowling inside her like a caged animal. The confrontation with Liam had left her shaken, but it was the beta's words that lingered in her mind. "We can't keep ignoring what's happening out there." She stopped in front of the mirror hanging on the wall, staring at her reflection. Her hood was still up, but she pushed it back, letting her hair fall loose over her shoulders. Her green eyes glinted in the faint light, sharp and assessing. Her wolf stirred again, quieter this time but insistent. "You could do it," the wolf seemed to say, its voice a low, steady growl in her mind. "You could lead. You could handle this." Aria clenched her jaw, her nails digging into the sleeves of her hoodie. "No," she muttered aloud. The wolf growled, dissatisfied but not surprised. She knew what Liam didn't, what none of them knew. Her ability to suppress her wolf instincts wasn't just unusual, it was unnatural. A quirk of her biology that had revealed itself in her teens, allowing her to silence her wolf's voice completely when needed. It was a secret she'd guarded fiercely. The pack saw strength and control, but they also feared what they didn't understand. If they found out, they wouldn't just see her as a leader, they'd see her as a threat. Aria sank onto the couch, dropping her head into her hands. The weight of her secret felt heavier than ever, a burden she'd carried alone for so long that it felt like a part of her. But now, with the pack's frustrations boiling over and Liam's expectations pressing down on her, it was harder to push it aside. "I can't," she murmured, her voice growled softly in the back of her mind, a reluctant acknowledgement of her decision. "Oh yeah." Aria sat in the quiet of her apartment, the tension in her body slowly easing as the minutes ticked by. Her wolf's growl faded to a low rumble, restless but subdued. Liam's words echoed in her mind, heavier than she wanted to admit. Outside, the city continued its relentless hum, oblivious to the storm brewing within her. Aria leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess of doubt, defiance, and the faintest trace of fear. Chapter 7: Rising Shadows. The library at the city archives was a relic of an earlier time, its high shelves crammed with dusty tomes and battered files. The fluorescent lighting overhead buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows across the room. A lone fan turned sluggishly in the corner, barely stirring the stale air. Evan Cross sat at a desk in the far corner, his laptop open in front of him, the screen's pale glow illuminating his face. Beside him lay a well-worn notebook, a camera, and a growing stack of files he'd pulled from the archives. The room was silent, except for the occasional scrape of paper as he flipped through pages, his focus unbroken. His fingers tapped restlessly against the edge of his notebook as he scanned the documents. Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw as he studied the latest set of files he'd unearthed. The pattern was unmistakable. Financial records that showed massive shipments of suppressant drugs ordered under the guise of medical supplies. The recipients? Small towns on the outskirts of the city, areas notorious for rogue werewolf activity. He frowned, flipping to another page. Meeting minutes from a unified council session hinted at discussions about alternative solutions to rogue integration. The language was vague, but the implications were chilling. Then he found it. A single memo buried among innocuous-looking correspondence. It detailed a covert agreement between a high-ranking council official and a known rogue leader. The words collaboration and shared goals jumped out at him like flashing warning signs. Evan's heart pounded as he jotted down notes in his notebook, his handwriting messier than usual in his haste. Why would the council supply suppressants to rogues, he thought, his brow furrowing. And what kind of shared goals could they possibly have? He glanced at the files again, a growing sense of unease curling in his gut. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a simple political scandal. It had the potential to upend everything he thought he knew about the council's role in maintaining peace between humans and wolves. Evan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply as he closed the file and stared at the ceiling. His instincts screamed at him that he was onto something dangerous. The silence in the room felt oppressive now, the faint buzz of the fan doing little to ease the tension knotting in his shoulders. He glanced over his shoulder, the weight of unseen eyes prickling at his neck. The room was empty, but the unease didn't fade. "You're being paranoid, Cross," he muttered to himself, forcing a wry smile, but the feeling didn't go away. His gaze flicked to his camera and notebook, the evidence he'd gathered so far, If he was right, exposing this story could have serious consequences, not just for him, but for anyone tied to the pack or the council. He hesitated for only a moment before shoving the files into his bag. His gut told him to leave now, before someone or something caught up to him. As he stepped out of the library and into the darkened hallway, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And for the first time in his career, he wondered if chasing a story was worth risking his life. The alley behind the library was drenched in shadows, the flickering light of a street lamp casting long, distorted shapes against the brick walls. Evan's footsteps echoed faintly as he adjusted the strap of his bag, his camera and notes tucked securely inside. The chill in the air wasn't what made him uneasy. It was the silence. He reached the midpoint of the alley when two figures emerged from the shadows ahead of him. Their movements were casual, almost lazy, but the predatory gleam in their eyes sent a warning shot straight to his gut. "Nice night for a walk," one of them said, his voice low and dripping with false cheer. Evan's steps faltered as he assessed them. The taller one had broad shoulders and a smirk that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. The second was wiry, his grin sharp and feral, his posture a little too relaxed. Evan tightened his grip on his bag, his heart pounding. Somehow they knew what he'd been digging into. "Don't let us keep you," the wiry one said, stepping to block Evan's path when he tried to sidestep them. "In a hurry?" Actually," Evan replied, forcing his voice to stay steady. His pulse hammered in his ears as he tried to calculate his next move. He wasn't a fighter, and they knew it. "Funny thing," the taller one said, his eyes flicking to Evan's bag. "We heard you've been poking around places you shouldn't, asking questions that don't need answers." Evan's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm a journalist. Asking questions is literally my job." The taller one's smirk widened. "Then consider this your day off." They stepped closer, their movements slow but deliberate. "Hand it over," the wiry one growled, nodding at the bag. "Yeah, that's not happening," Evan said, his voice firmer than he felt. His defiance flared, but fear clawed at his chest. He knew he didn't stand a chance if they decided to escalate. Before the wolves could advance, a sharp growl rumbled through the alley, low and menacing. The two wolves froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. From the shadows behind them, Aria stepped into the dim light, her hood down, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes glowed faintly, an unmistakable warning that sent a ripple of unease through the air. "That's enough," she said, her voice steady and laced with authority. The taller wolf sneered, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Stay out of this, Thorn. It's none of your business." Aria's gaze didn't waver. "You're making it my business." Her tone was razor sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Walk away while you still can," the wiry one growled, his posture tense. Big talk for someone outnumbered. Aria's lips curved into a cold smile. "You really want to test that theory?" The taller wolf muttered a curse under his breath, but the wiry one lunged. Aria moved like lightning. She sidestepped the attack effortlessly, her hand darting out to grab the wolf's arm. With a sharp twist, she disarmed him, slamming him against the brick wall with enough force to make him grunt in pain. The taller wolf growled but didn't move, his hesitation growing as Aria turned her glowing gaze on him. "Do you want to be next?" she asked, her tone dangerously calm. The taller wolf snarled, his hands curling into fists, but he backed away, tugging his dazed companion with him. "This isn't over," he spat, his eyes narrowing at Evan. Aria stepped forward, her presence radiating authority. "It is for tonight. Now leave." They retreated into the shadows, their growls fading as they disappeared down the alley. Evan exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping as the tension bled out of his body. He looked at Aria, equal parts stunned and impressed. "I could have handled it," he muttered, though the unsteadiness in his voice betrayed him. Aria raised an eyebrow, brushing off her sleeves. "Sure," she deadpanned. "You had them right where you wanted them." Evan let out a weak laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Remind me not to argue with you." "Smart choice," Aria said, her smirk fading as her gaze flicked toward the end of the alley. Her wolf growled softly, still on edge. "We need to get out of here, now." Evan hesitated, his curiosity flaring again. Who were they? And why did they know my name? Aria's jaw tightened. "Later," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Just move." Without waiting for a reply, she started toward his car, her steps quick and purposeful. Evan followed, his mind racing as questions piled on top of each other. But one thought cut through the noise. Whatever mess he'd stumbled into, Aria was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The alley was behind them, but the tension clung to the air like smoke. Evan's car was parked haphazardly near the curb, the driver's side door still slightly ajar. The engine had cooled, leaving the night unnervingly quiet. Evan fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the encounter began to wear off. Aria stood a few feet away, leaning against the hood of the car. Her arms were crossed, her stance casual, but her posture screamed tension. "So," Evan said, his voice sharper than intended as he shot her a glance. "What's your excuse for showing up?" "I was nearby," she replied. Her tone clipped, her gaze flicking to the alley as though expecting the wolves to reappear at any moment. "Nearby?" Evan echoed, narrowing his eyes. "Or keeping tabs on me?" Aria didn't answer immediately, her expression unreadable. Instead, she straightened, her wolf simmering beneath her skin. "You're in over your head, Cross," she said finally. "Whatever you've uncovered, it's not worth getting killed over." "That's for me to decide," Evan shot back, the defiance in his tone a little too loud. "And you don't get to make that call." Aria's eyes locked on his, sharp and unwavering. "Fine," she said, stepping closer. The cool night air seemed to thicken between them as she closed the distance. "Then I'm coming with you." Evan blinked, caught off guard. "Why would you do that?" Her gaze hardened, but her voice softened slightly. "Because I'm not letting those idiots tear you apart, and because whatever you're digging into might affect my pack, too." Evan hesitated, his grip tightening on his keys. Her words carried a weight that made his chest tighten, the unspoken truth hovering between them. She doesn't have to do this, but she was choosing to anyway. "Guess we're carpooling then," he muttered, opening the driver's side door. "Yes, we are," Aria replied, slipping into the passenger seat without waiting for an invitation. The car sped through the city streets, the hum of the engine a low backdrop to the silence inside. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across their faces as they drove, neither of them speaking at first. Aria stared out the window, her arms crossed over her chest, her posture deceptively relaxed. But Evan noticed the way her fingers tapped against her arm, a small, restless motion that betrayed her unease. He stole a glance at her, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Thanks for, saving my life back there." Aria turned her head, raising an eyebrow. "You don't need to thank me." "Well, I'm doing it anyway," he said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "So, thanks." She smirked faintly, a flicker of amusement breaking through her guarded expression. "Don't get used to it." Evan let out a breath of laughter, though the tension between them didn't ease entirely. For a moment the silence felt less heavy, the distance between them shrinking ever so slightly. Aria's gaze drifted back to the window, her wolf growling softly in her chest. She didn't tell Evan, but she knew tonight's ambush wasn't random. Those wolves weren't working alone. Someone had sent them. The thought made her stomach tighten, her instincts urging her to be ready for whatever came next. Beside her, Evan's jaw was set, his mind racing as the weight of his discovery settled over him. Whatever he'd stumbled onto was bigger than he'd realized, and now it wasn't just his life at stake. As the city lights blurred past, they both knew there was no turning back. Chapter 8: Forced Trust. The motel loomed ahead like a relic of another era, its faded neon sign blinking intermittently. The letters spelling out Vakanki buzzed faintly in the quiet night, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Evan pulled his car under the lone streetlight, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than the tension in the car, both of them still reeling from the events of the night. "This is your idea of safe?" Aria asked, her tone dry as her sharp eyes scanned their surroundings. Evan leaned back in his seat, exhaling heavily. "It's not about luxury, Thorn. It's about being off the radar." Aria's lips curved into something resembling a smirk, but her gaze didn't soften. "Well, you nailed that. No one in their right mind would come here." They climbed out of the car, the air cool and damp around them. Evan grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder as they headed to the lobby. The interior of the motel was no better than its exterior. The dim lighting revealed scuffed linoleum floors, an appealing floral wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. A bored-looking clerk glanced up from behind the counter, his eyes barely registering their presence. Evan stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He gave a fake name, paid in cash, and didn't ask for a receipt. Aria stayed by the door, her back to the wall, her gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a predator. Once they had the key, they made their way down the narrow hallway to their room. The single bulb overhead flickered as Evan unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was small and bare bones. A sagging bed, a rickety table with mismatched chairs, and a bathroom door hanging slightly ajar. The wallpaper was faded and the smell of cheap cleaning products lingered in the air. Evan tossed his bag onto the table and sank into one of the chairs, running a hand through his hair. Aria moved to the window, pulling back the thin curtain just enough to get a clear view of the parking lot. "You're going to wear a hole in the carpet," Evan muttered, his tone half teasing as he watched her pace back and forth. "I'll stop pacing when I feel like we're not sitting ducks," Aria shot back, her tone sharper than intended. Evan sighed but didn't argue. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of the neon sign outside. After a beat, Evan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knee. "You don't trust me, do you?" Aria stopped pacing, turning to face him with a raised eyebrow. "You make it hard," she said simply. Evan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Funny, coming from someone who's been dodging my questions since we met." Aria shrugged, crossing her arms. "You ask too many." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their unspoken truths filling the room. Then Evan's expression shifted, his usual sharpness replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. "I have my reasons," he said finally, his voice low. He hesitated, then added, "My mom was killed by a wolf." The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Aria didn't flinch, but her wolf stirred uneasily, the growl in her chest faint but steady. "What happened?" she asked, her tone careful. Evan hesitated, his eyes distant as he recounted the story. "A rogue attacked her when I was 10. It was quick, random, and brutal." He paused, his jaw tightening. The council brushed it off as an isolated incident, said there was nothing they could do. The pack in my town, they didn't even acknowledge it. No apologies, no responsibility, nothing. "They called it an accident," he continued bitterly, like her life didn't matter. Aria's posture softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "Not all wolves are like that," she said quietly, her words lacking defensiveness. "Just a simple truth." Evan let out a harsh laugh. Easy to say when you're not on the receiving end. Aria stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. You think being a wolf is easy? She asked, her voice sharp but not angry. We're constantly fighting to prove we're not monsters. To prove we belong in a world that doesn't want us. Evan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The tension simmered between them, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it. Something softer. I didn't say it was fair, Evan said after a long pause, his voice quieter. But it doesn't make it easier to trust. Aria leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. I get that, she said softly, but trust goes both ways. Evan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't forgiveness, or even agreement, but a faint crack in the walls they'd both built around themselves. The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one felt heavier, weighted with the beginnings of understanding. The dim light in the motel room buzzed faintly, filling the quiet spaces between their words. Aria leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her posture as closed off as ever, yet her eyes softened slightly as she looked at Evan, their conversation lingering in a fragile truce. I've never trusted humans completely, Aria admitted, her voice low. Not after seeing how fast they turn on wolves when fear takes over. Evan's gaze flicked up, catching the faint vulnerability in her tone. You think I'm going to turn on you? Aria's lips curved faintly, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Even now, she said, her voice dry. I'm still waiting for you to pull a gun on me. Evan's lips twitched in what could have been a smile. I left it in the car, he said, his tone wry. Good, Aria replied, her expression neutral but her tone faintly teasing. For a moment, the sharp edges of their dynamic seemed to dull. The air between them felt lighter, the tension giving way to something that almost felt like camaraderie. Evan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. You know, this wasn't exactly how I pictured tonight going, he said, breaking the silence. Aria raised an eyebrow. How did you picture it? Definitely fewer wolves trying to kill me, he said, his lips curving into a small grin. Aria smirked faintly. Welcome to my world. The quiet humor between them began to fill the space, loosening the weight that had hung over the room since they arrived. Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. First big story I ever wrote, he began, his voice taking on a lighter tone, was about a corrupt city councilman. Spent weeks tracking his meetings, digging through financial records, following him to coffee shops. And? Aria prompted. Turned out he wasn't laundering money, Evan admitted with a sheepish grin. He was running an underground chess league. Aria snorted, the sound catching her off guard. What? Evan asked, his grin widening. Nothing, Aria said, though the faint smile on her lips lingered. It's just, I don't know. I didn't peg you as someone who'd stick with something after finding out it wasn't what you expected. Evan shrugged. Maybe I'm stubborn. Aria tilted her head slightly. Or just stupidly persistent. Same thing, Evan quipped. Aria shook her head, her expression softening. You remind me of someone I used to know, she said after a pause. A packmate who tried to teach me to dance once. He was just as persistent as you. I stepped on his toes the whole time, Evan chuckled. And did he give up? Eventually, Aria said, her tone light, when he realized my stubbornness beat his persistence. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence. The weight of the night momentarily lifted. For the first time since they'd met, the space between them felt less like a battlefield and more like common ground. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the faint hum of the neon sign outside blending with the muffled sounds of distant traffic. Aria stood by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Her wolf stirred uneasily, a low growl rumbling in her chest that only she could hear. "What is it?" Evan asked from the table, his voice breaking the silence. Aria didn't look away from the window. "You're not alone," she said quietly, her tone edged with a calm that belied the tension in her posture. Evan moved to stand beside her, his heart pounding as he followed her gaze. The parking lot appeared empty, the streetlight casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. He didn't see anything, but the way Aria's body tensed sent a chill down his spine. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice low. Aria nodded, stepping back from the window. "Wolves don't growl for no reason." Evan swallowed hard, his hand instinctively reaching for his bag. "So, what's the plan?" Aria's expression was hard, her green eyes glinting with determination. "Get ready to move," she murmured, her voice steady. "Move where?" Evan asked, his voice rising slightly as the weight of the situation settled over him. Aria shot him a glance, her tone firm. "Anywhere but here." The air in the room felt charged, the unspoken threat lingering just beyond the walls. Evan nodded, grabbing his bag and slinging it over his shoulder. As they moved toward the door, his mind raced with questions, but he didn't voice them. For now, survival was the only thing that mattered. Chapter 9. A close call. The desolate road stretched endlessly into the night, flanked by dense woods that swallowed the light beyond the car's high beams. The cracked asphalt shimmered faintly under the glow of the headlights, but the world outside the car felt suffocatingly dark. Evan gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles stark white against the dim glow of the dashboard. The silence between him and Aria was thick, the hum of the engine the only sound. In the passenger seat, Aria's posture was tense. Her gaze flicked to the side mirror, then out the window, her sharp green eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to press closer with every mile. Her wolf stirred uneasily, a low growl rumbling in her chest that made her fingers curl against her thighs. "Something's wrong," she murmured, her voice tight. Evan shot her a quick glance, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "They're here," she said simply, her tone deadly calm. Evan's stomach sank. "What do you mean, they're here?" Before he could finish, a deafening thud slammed into the side of the car. The vehicle skidded violently, tires screeching as Evan fought to regain control. "Shit!" he yelled, jerking the wheel as the car spun, the headlights swinging wildly across the road. The car came to a screeching halt, the engine sputtering in protest. Evan barely had time to catch his breath before he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms massive and unmistakably lupine. The moonlight caught the gleam of their eyes and the sharp edges of their fangs as they advanced, their growls filling the night. "Get out of the car," one of them snarled, his voice rough and menacing. Evan scrambled out of the car, his heart pounding as he took in the wolves circling them. Their sheer size made his stomach churn. They looked like they'd been built for destruction. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" he hissed, glancing at Aria. Aria stepped out with deliberate calm, closing the door behind her. Her wolf growled again, louder this time, the sound rolling out of her like a warning bell. She didn't answer him directly, her gaze fixed on the rogues. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice low but commanding. Evan hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the sinking feeling that Aria was about to throw herself into something insane. The wolves closed in, their snarls rising. One of them stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly. "Hand over the human," he growled, his voice rough. "You don't want to die for him." Aria moved forward, her posture steady and unflinching. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone deadly calm. The rogue bared his teeth in a snarl. "Walk away, Thorn. This isn't your fight." Aria's lips curved into a cold smile, her wolf just beneath the surface, Try me." The tension snapped like a bowstring, and the wolves lunged. The first wolf leaped at her, but Aria was faster. She sidestepped with precision, driving her elbow into his side and sending him sprawling to the ground. Another came at her from the left, but she twisted, grabbing his arm and using his momentum to slam him against the car with a sickening crunch. Evan stood frozen, his back pressed against the car as he watched. His mind raced, caught between terror and awe. Aria moved like a force of nature, controlled, deliberate, lethal. She didn't flinch, her movements fluid and efficient as she dodged claws and teeth. The third wolf lunged, snapping at her, but she ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him and delivering a sharp kick to his ribs. Evan's jaw dropped. He'd known she was capable, but this was something else entirely. One of the rogues hesitated, his growl faltering as he eyed Aria warily. "You're outnumbered," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Aria straightened, blood dripping from a shallow cut on her arm. Her glowing green eyes locked on him, and her wolf growled low and menacing. "Not for long," she said, her tone ice cold. The rogue backed away, his ears flattening as the others retreated, dragging their wounded with them. As the last of them disappeared into the shadows, the road fell silent once more, save for the sound of Evan's ragged breathing. The road was eerily quiet in the aftermath, the growls and snarls of the rogue wolves fading into the dense woods. Evan's chest heaved as he leaned against the car, his heart pounding in his ears. Aria stood a few feet away, her posture rigid. The faint glow in her eyes dimmed as she let her wolf settle. She exhaled slowly, but the motion made her stumble. "Aria?" Evan pushed off the car, rushing to her side. She clutched her side, blood seeping between her fingers and staining the hem of her hoodie. Her breathing was labored, but her expression was stoic. "It's nothing," she said, brushing him off as she tried to straighten. Evan caught her arm, his voice sharp. "Nothing? You're bleeding. You just took on half a pack of wolves, and you're hurt." Aria gave him a faint smirk, though the pain in her expression was clear. "Tell that to them," she murmured, tilting her head toward the direction the rogues had fled. The adrenaline coursing through Evan's veins made it hard to focus, but one thing was clear: she wasn't invincible, and despite her bravado, she wasn't okay. "Stop trying to act like you can do this alone," he snapped, his frustration born more from worry than anger. Aria blinked, her smirk fading as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time since they'd met, he wasn't looking at her like a threat, or even an anomaly. He was looking at her like an ally. "You saved my ass back there," he said, his voice softening as he adjusted his grip to steady her. "Let me return the favor." Aria hesitated, her usual guarded nature flickering in her gaze, but the exhaustion in her body won out, and she gave him a small nod. Evan slipped his arm around her waist, helping her toward the car. "See? Teamwork. Not so bad, right?" "Don't push your luck," she muttered, though there was no bite in her words. The car was parked at the edge of a forest clearing, its headlights off to keep them hidden. Inside, the quiet was broken only by the faint sound of their breathing. Aria slumped in the passenger seat, her head tilted back against the headrest. Her hoodie was damp with blood, but she'd done her best to stop the bleeding with a makeshift bandage from the glove compartment. "You should go," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan frowned, glancing at her. "What? They're after you, not me," Aria continued, her eyes half closed. "You'll be safer if you leave me here." Evan's jaw tightened. "Not happening." Aria turned her head, her sharp green eyes meeting his. "I'll slow you down," she said, her voice steadier this time. Evan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the steering wheel as he stared at her. "You didn't leave me back there," he said, his voice firm. "Even when you could have. I'm not leaving you now." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. She blinked, a flicker of surprise softening her expression. "You're a pain in the ass, you know that?" she murmured. Evan smiled faintly, the tension easing just a fraction. "Yeah, but I'm your pain in the ass." Aria snorted softly, the sound half a laugh, half a wince. The quiet settled over them again, heavier now. Aria shifted in her seat, her wolf stirring restlessly beneath her skin. A low growl rumbled in her chest, making her sit up straighter. Evan glanced at her, his hand hovering near the keys. "What is it?" Aria's gaze drifted out the window, scanning the dark woods beyond the clearing. Her voice was low but certain. "This isn't over." Evan didn't ask how she knew. The tension in her body, the unease in her wolf. It told him enough. "Whoever sent those rogues won't stop until they get what they want," she continued, her tone grim. Evan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his resolve hardening. "Then we make sure they don't get it." Aria turned her gaze back to him, studying the determination in his expression. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could do this together. The engine roared to life as Evan started the car, the two of them bracing for whatever came next. Chapter 10. Unlikely Allies. The car's engine cut off with a low rumble, and the faint sound of distant trains took its place. Evan killed the headlights, leaving them cloaked in darkness except for the faint glow of the moon overhead. The storage facility loomed ahead, tucked away behind rows of derelict warehouses. Its graffiti-covered walls bore faded remnants of spray-painted defiance, and the air carried the tang of rust and oil. "This is it?" Aria asked, raising an eyebrow as she leaned against the window. Her sharp green eyes flicked over the facility with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. Evan smirked, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Not exactly Fort Knox, I know, but that's the point. No one's looking for us here." Aria sighed, muttering under her breath as she opened her door. "Let's hope you're right." The rusted side door groaned as Evan shoved it open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the facility. The air inside was stagnant, tinged with the metallic scent of old machinery. The floor was littered with abandoned crates, and a few overturned chairs sat forgotten in the corners. Evan gestured her inside, his tone casual. "Home sweet home." Aria stepped through the doorway, her wolf stirring uneasily as she scanned the space. A makeshift desk sat in the middle of the room, cluttered with papers, open files, and a laptop. The faint hum of the machine was the only sound apart from their footsteps. "You've been working out of here?" Aria asked, her tone more incredulous than curious. "It's not glamorous," Evan admitted as he powered up his laptop, "but it gets the job done." Aria shook her head, leaning against one of the crates. "You're not worried about leaving a paper trail?" Evan looked up, smirking. "Who needs a paper trail when no one's supposed to know you're here?" Her lips twitched in a faint smirk of her own, but her wolf's unease didn't fade. Aria dropped into one of the battered chairs, crossing her arms as she watched him sift through his files. "You're seriously planning to keep digging after what just happened?" Evan didn't look up, his jaw set as he scrolled through a document on his laptop. "I'm not stopping now. Not when I'm this close." "This close to getting yourself killed," Aria muttered, her voice sharp but low. Evan finally met her gaze, his expression determined. "If I stop now, they win. They get to keep doing whatever it is they're doing, and no one will hold them accountable." Aria leaned back, shaking her head. "You don't even know what you're up against." "That helped me figure it out," he said, his voice softer but no less insistent. Her wolf growled softly, a low rumble of caution that made her sit up straighter. "You're playing with fire, Cross," she said, her tone laced with warning. Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Good thing I brought someone who knows how to handle flames." The room fell quiet, the weight of their unspoken fears settling between them. "Fine," Aria said after a long pause, her voice grudging. "But if you get yourself killed, don't expect me to feel sorry for you." Evan chuckled, the tension easing just slightly. No, the air in the hideout was heavy, a mix of stagnant dust and quiet tension. The bluish glow of Evan's laptop bathed the room in soft light, flickering occasionally with each page he scrolled through. Overhead, a lone bulb buzzed faintly, adding a faint hum to the quiet. Evan sat at the makeshift desk, his focus laser-sharp as he sifted through a mountain of files and photos. His camera sat nearby, along with a notepad filled with scrawled notes. Aria lounged in a battered chair a few feet away, her arms crossed as she observed him. Her sharp eyes moved between Evan and the screen, her skepticism clear in the arch of her brow. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "Proof," Evan replied without looking up, his tone clipped. "Of what?" "That the Council and the rogues are working together," he said, scrolling through a series of documents. "They're not just letting the rogues run wild, they're using them. I just need to figure out why." Aria tilted her head slightly, her wolf growling softly in the back of her mind. "That's a dangerous assumption." "It's not an assumption," Evan shot back, glancing at her briefly. "It's a lead. And I'm not dropping it." As Evan flipped to the next photo, Aria leaned forward, her sharp gaze locking onto an image of a protest. Dozens of wolves and humans filled the frame, their expressions a mix of anger and defiance. "That guy," she said, pointing to a figure in the background, a wiry man with a scar running down his jawline. Evan followed her gesture, narrowing his eyes. "You know him?" Aria nodded, her tone dark. "He used to run with a rogue pack near my territory. They're small-time but ruthless." Evan's fingers flew across the keyboard as he cross-referenced the image with another file. Moments later he froze, his eyes widening. "And here he is again," he said, pulling up a council document. The screen displayed a list of payments made to an unnamed third party, but the rogue's name was listed in the notes section. "They're using rogues to do their dirty work," Aria muttered, her voice edged with anger. "The council's too smart to get their hands dirty directly. This is their way of keeping deniability." Evan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply as the pieces began to fall into place. "So they fund the rogues, let them create chaos, and swoop in as the saviors. Meanwhile, the pack system takes the blame for not keeping the rogues in check." Aria's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. "It's more than just politics. They're playing with lives." The tension between them began to shift, the sharp edges of their earlier exchanges softening. Evan's focus remained intense, but his respect for Aria's insight was evident in the way he included her in his process. Every question he asked was sharp but purposeful, and every observation she made added weight to the growing pile of evidence. "You're not as clueless as I thought," Aria said after a while, leaning back in her chair. Evan glanced at her, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "High praise coming from you. Don't let it go to your head," she quipped, though there was a glimmer of humor in her eyes. As they continued working, the room's atmosphere shifted from tense to collaborative. For the first time since their uneasy alliance began, it felt like they were on the same side. But the weight of what they were uncovering lingered, a reminder that their alliance was born not out of trust, but necessity. The glow of Evan's laptop had dimmed to its screensaver, leaving the room bathed in soft shadows. The faint hum of the overhead bulb was the only sound as the pair sat in silence, catching their breath after hours of research. Evan pulled a bottle of water from his bag and tossed it to Aria, who caught it effortlessly. She twisted off the cap and took a long sip, leaning back in her chair as she finally allowed herself to relax. Evan settled across from her, his elbows resting on his knees. "Why'd you step in back there?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Aria raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "At the ambush," he clarified. You could have walked away, let them have me, but you didn't. She shrugged, her gaze dropping to the floor. Letting them kill you would have been messy. Evan's lips quirked in a half smile. Messy? That's it? Aria hesitated, her fingers absently twisting the cap of the water bottle. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Fine. Maybe I didn't want to see you torn apart. Happy? Evan chuckled softly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. You keep saying you don't care, but you keep proving otherwise. Aria glanced up at him, her expression unreadable at first, but there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes, a crack in the walls she kept so firmly in place. Maybe I care too much, she admitted, her voice barely above a murmur. That's the problem. Evan's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. Caring isn't a problem, Aria. It's what makes you, you. She snorted, though the sound lacked her usual sharpness, spoken like someone who's never had to pick up the pieces after caring too much. Evan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You'd be surprised, he said quietly. Aria tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face, but she didn't press him. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her wolf settling as the tension in the room softened. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were on opposite sides of a fight. It felt like they were allies, maybe even friends. I'm not as easy to get rid of as you think, you know, Evan said, breaking the silence with a faint grin. Aria smirked, her lips curving just slightly. Don't I know it? The quiet that followed was different this time, not heavy with mistrust or unspoken conflict, but something lighter. Something that felt like the start of an understanding. The hideout had fallen into a tense quiet, the soft buzz of the laptop the only sound. Aria's wolf had settled, her earlier sharp edges softening into something calmer. Evan sat across from her, leaning back in his chair, when the distant crunch of tires on gravel shattered the stillness. Aria stiffened immediately, her wolf growling softly in her chest. Her eyes snapped to the door, her entire posture going rigid. Someone's here, she said, her voice low and clipped. Evan froze, his pulse quickening. He grabbed his camera instinctively, his eyes darting toward the makeshift desk where his files were scattered. You think it's them? Aria tilted her head, listening to the subtle rhythm of the approaching vehicle. She didn't relax. No, she said, her tone sharp with certainty. It's worse. The rumble of the engine stopped, and seconds later heavy footsteps approached the door. The door creaked open slowly, and Liam stepped inside, his tall, imposing figure filling the small space. The faint light from outside illuminated his piercing blue eyes, which locked on Aria first, before sliding to Evan. This is where you've been hiding, Liam said, his tone calm but laced with an authority that made the air feel heavier. Aria straightened, her jaw tightening as she faced him. What are you doing here? The better question, Liam said, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing, is what you're doing here with him. Evan stood, his shoulders squaring despite the clear tension in the room. We're trying to figure out why people keep trying to kill me, he said, his tone sharp. Maybe you can explain. Liam's gaze snapped to Evan, his wolf simmering beneath the surface. For a moment, his calm facade cracked, revealing the barely restrained power behind his words. This is pack business, not his. Aria took a step forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. If the council's involved, it's everyone's business. Liam's lips pressed into a thin line as he studied her. You don't know what you're getting into, Aria. This isn't a fight you can win. Evan glanced between them, his frustration bubbling over. Oh, so I'm just supposed to sit back and let them come after me? Liam's gaze snapped to him, his wolf flaring just enough to make the hair on Evan's arms stand on end. You've already put Aria in enough danger, he growled, If you want to play hero, leave the pack out of it." "Leave the pack out of it?" Aria snapped, her voice rising. "The pack is already involved, Liam. Don't act like this is just his mess. It's all connected." Liam turned back to her, his expression hard. "And do you think dragging him into it is going to solve anything?" Aria's eyes glinted with defiance as she stepped closer. "He's not the one dragging anyone. The council is playing both sides, and if you can't see that, then you're part of the problem." The room pulsed with tension, the energy between them crackling like a live wire. Evan stood his ground, his heart pounding as he watched the clash between the two wolves. "I'm not going anywhere," Evan said finally, his voice firm. "Not until we figure this out." Liam's jaw clenched, his wolf growling faintly in his chest. But it wasn't anger that flickered in his eyes, it was concern. "This isn't over," Liam said after a long pause, his tone quieter but no less intense. He turned to Aria, his gaze lingering on her. "Be careful, Aria. You're playing a dangerous game." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and strode out, the door creaking shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evan glanced at Aria, his voice hesitant. "So, that went well." Aria let out a sharp breath, running a hand through her hair. "You have no idea what you just signed up for." Evan's lips quirked into a faint grin, his usual humor returning. "Guess I'll figure it out along the way." But neither of them missed the weight of Liam's warning, or the growing storm on the horizon. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey so far. But trust me, the story is far from over. The twists, the revelations, and the emotions are only just beginning to unravel. You don't want to miss what happens next. It's where the narrative truly comes alive. Continue this adventure seamlessly by heading to the next part of the audiobook, where the story deepens and the stakes get even higher. Click the link in the description to dive straight in. Don't wait. Your next chapter awaits, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it.